Okay, so I wonder how many of you have already heard me speak and give a COVID update. If you just wave your hands. Okay, so Liz and Karen. Yeah, so I hate to bore you on this.
It was
So
a couple months ago.
okay, well, yeah, everything I said back then is wrong anyway. So
Yeah, right.
it's changed, and I'm within about 15 minutes from now, everything will be changed again. And I do want to cover things that you're interested in. So please, since it's a small group, please interrupt and just just speak up if I don't see you. But I do want to be able to just take what you already know about COVID and be able to add to it. Maybe make it easier to explain to others, because many of you are in a position where you're leading and people turn to you for information so that you can answer it accurately, and also, I guess, preface it with, the fact that things do change, and we have to sort of be flexible. Things that we were assured of earlier have not quite worked as planned, and things have been quite a bit different. So I'm going to try to share my screen and see if does that show up okay? Okay.
Yes.
And so as I usually start by saying that at the hospital, we have what's called an incident command system. And every large organization should have an incident command system in place that can be activated when something's happening. It doesn't have to be something wrong, like a hurricane or a tornado or something like that, but it can be when I think something is a big deal. So if you were going to have something that is going to be having many moving parts, we activate the incident command system. Let's see. Let me see if I can get a pointer here. So at our hospital, we had set up our incident command because of COVID, and we have an active dashboard that's displayed in the command center. And this, of course, the command center was actually more being utilized when things were very busy. Things have improved markedly when we look at the numbers. And so I want to show your attention to right here. The number of patients that have COVID in the hospital is currently 63. And there are dozens of these patients that are actually recovered, but they had come from nursing homes that we helped out, because when an outbreak occurs at a nursing home, for some of them, it's very hard for them to manage the patient there and protect the others. So we tended to take those patients on. So you could say there's a few dozen of these that are actually waiting to go back to the nursing home once the conditions at the nursing home are safe. The patient's actually doing okay. But you can see in blue where there are confirmed COVID positive patients. Now, we do have some, because this was actually updated about 25 minutes ago. There are some patients where the test is pending. Now, seriously ill patients, we have 2 patients on a ventilator. Now, to give some context, this number could have been up in the 130s a few months ago, and this number was a couple dozen were on the ventilator. And because we're seeing other patients, there are other patients on ventilators, and so we keep track of that, and we have about 26 on a ventilator right now, which is shown by the little lung here. So there's 1, 2 in 2 different intensive care units that have COVID. But we had this number up to the 50s when things were at its worst, but we still had capacity. So the reason we watch this carefully is to make sure we have an eye on capacity, and we can also see what is our needs. And the Incident Command Center not only is a place where you have dashboards like this, but this is where the planning takes place, the ability to perform logistics of where we're going to get supplies, where are we storing things, the various operations we're doing as far as managing visitors, security, looking at the different processes like testing that we have outpatient. So there are a number of things that we are doing and looking at. For those of you who've been involved with the, I guess, COVID up close and personal, you may have, seen a little bit of this, which is called contact tracing. If you've known somebody that's been COVID positive, or if you have, this is something that's attempted. It is very hard to do depending upon the disease. But the health department is doing this where they try to say, hey, if you're the person who is sick with COVID, you're for the sake of defining terms, you're the index person. And you really want to go back in time to say, well, where did you catch it from? Now with COVID, that could have been something 3, 4, 5, maybe 7, 8 days ago. So where were you, 5, 6, 7, 8 days ago? And that could be pretty hard, especially if you weren't quite aware that the people you were around during all those days were having COVID. You may or may not have known. But it can help, because if you could help determine, well, who, where, why did you catch this? There may be other people who were catching it at the same time, and they are sick at the same time you are getting sick. And so you can imagine that being attempted at the schools or in a business or anywhere out in the public. And, trying to be able to say, if you've been exposed, do the right thing. And then it's not just about going back in time. Obviously, the more important thing is to actually go forward in time to say, okay, you're now sick, you have a positive test. What day did you get sick? And when you look at that day, you go back 48 hours and ask, who were you around for the last 2 days? Because before you got sick, you were likely spreading the virus or could have spread the virus. So let's make sure we identify and alert those people so they know they've been exposed. And it's looking into the nature of that interaction. Was it within 6 feet? Who was wearing a mask? Who was not wearing a mask? Was it greater than 15 minutes? And letting these folks know they may be exposed. They probably don't have symptoms, but they need to keep a lookout. And right now, you've heard numbers like 14 days that these folks, have to keep an eye out for themselves for about 14 days to make sure they don't get sick. So you can imagine you're really focused in on this person, and you're almost drawing a circle around them. And we call it a concentric circle because in the center is, well, who are they in a car with every day? Who are they living with every single day? And those are the people most at risk. But then you think, well, gosh, if they get all infected, we'd have to worry about some of the next circles, and that might be, friends and coworkers and people they may interact with at a less intense way. And then further out, we can actually, at some point, try to reassure people, reassure you that, you're 2 or 3 circles away. If you only, met this person for 2 minutes and it was a very brief interaction, and not to be as concerned. Just want to say, if any questions, let me know. I'm not going to cover things. I think many of you are very familiar with how many people are mild and some do get very sick, and the things that do to prevent it. But one thing I do find helpful to show is how delicate the virus is viruses in general are constructed somewhat differently. There's 2 general groups, and it has to do with how the genetic material, shown in red here, and I'll show it again here, the genetic material, how is it packaged? Now this genetic material in pink here is packaged with shown in color here, red membrane. And this is an envelope that goes around it and makes it sort of a vehicle. Well, this envelope is made out of fat when it comes to the COVID, and it's very delicate. It breaks apart under extreme conditions, and that could be a hand sanitizer, your everyday cleaning supplies. So these do break it up. And why is that important? When you break up this membrane, you dislodge and disrupt and destroy these proteins that are sticking out. And I'll show you these spike proteins. This is a very important part of the virus. The spike protein is what allows it to stick to your tissues, lining your nose, lining your throat. So you can break this up with just everyday things. And I point that out as a difference because there's other viruses in the world that don't have a delicate membrane. They have very hardy membranes, and that would be like the norovirus that causes the cruise ship diarrhea outbreaks. It has a protein envelope. and it's very hardy. You can't use a hand sanitizer to get rid of that sucker. It's going to need soap and water. It's going to need diluted bleach. But the same is true for the hepatitis A virus, and there's a few others out there. But fortunately, cold and flu viruses and the HIV virus, they're very delicate when it comes to that. I do want to make sure we remember this picture here is that this spike protein is going to be important. The spike protein will be important when we talk about how does it infect you and how are we going to vaccinate ourselves against this virus. A bit of a scientific diagram here, but this is a human cell. If you look at this, this blue curved line, everything below it is inside you, which is the lining of your throat or nose or lung, or it could be the lining of your blood vessels. This is your cells. So it could be a different cells, but the interesting part about your cells, you naturally have many, many proteins sticking out of your cells that they did not draw. Okay, they didn't show all the proteins that are sticking out of your cells, except for this one, these two right here. And this one they show in particular, it's shaped like a Y, and it's called an ACE2 receptor. It has another job in the world. I mean, it's supposed to do something for your body that is meant to help your body. However, the coronavirus takes advantage of that projection coming out of your cell by matching it up to the projection coming out of the virus. So you see these little spike proteins, which gives the name the coronavirus. It fits like a lock and a key to this receptor that just happens to be on the lining of some of your tissues, lining of your blood vessels, lining of your throat and lungs. When this connection occurs, it sends a signal that causes your body to suck in the virus. And once the virus is inside you, the genetic material in the virus takes over your machinery and starts telling your body what to do. Now, many of you already know this process from biology, but I think of ways that we can explain this to others who do not have the understanding of how things occur, like infections. But when you see that once this virus is inside you, it releases the genetic material, which is in blue. It's very similar to DNA, the genetic material in us, but it's slightly different. It's called RNA, but it's basically the same situation. So the RNA is the genetic material. It's instructions that take over your cell to tell you to make the viral ingredients that can be used to manufacture new virus. So as you see, the RNA comes in, your body's machinery, which is shown here, starts making all the proteins, not just the spike proteins, but all the proteins that are needed to create a brand new virus by the millions. Of course, it also duplicates the genetic material. So here you can see what was probably millions and millions of copies of the RNA, and it gets shoved into here, and then out pops the virus to go off and infect other parts of your body, or to come out of your mouth or your nose to infect other people. So that's a key concept, because we're going to be wanting to think about how does this affect testing? How does this affect the vaccine? Can we design medicines that interfere with different parts of this process? And that's how we do that for all the other germs that we try to treat. So that's going to be a key issue, and I might try to refer back to that later.
Doctor?
Yes.
Can I ask a question? Is this where the when you were back the previous slide, was that where the cytokine storm comes in? Is that when it starts, when your body starts manufacturing all of these?
Actually, the cytokine storm is the rest of your body's response to what's happening inside this cell. So imagine this is the lining of your throat and lungs, and this is occurring in many cells in the lining. Now, your immune system is going to soon recognize that there's something wrong. And whenever you get an infection, your body, not what's being depicted here or in the inside here, but the other parts of your body, the immune system, they start to respond by making chemicals to rev up your immune system. And it's actually those chemicals that give you a fever, that give you the body aches, that make you feel pretty miserable, as it's the chemicals that also rev up your immune system to go fight this infection and take the battle to this cell right here, because this is what you want to destroy. Unfortunately, it used to be the lining of your throat, but now it's got to be destroyed because it's now a virus factory. And in the process of putting out millions of viruses, it's probably going to die anyway. So the immune system is going to attack this, and the immune system's responding by making these chemicals called cytokines, and there are many other names. And what I'll get to later is that is the right thing to do. But when you have other diseases like chronic inflammation, which we see in high blood pressure and obesity, we have a hard time of turning this off when we have other diseases like that. And when we get older, we have a hard time turning that off. And we see that it gets out of control. And that's the cytokine storm. Our immune system overly produces these chemicals, and you get too much inflammation added to the already pre-existing inflammation you have because of obesity, hypertension, or advanced age or other diseases. And then it becomes a big mess. Now you've got way too much immune system attacking all of this process. Imagine the entire lining of your lung, your blood vessels, and too much inflammation leads to other diseases even after the virus factory has been destroyed. And you're not even making the virus anymore, but your immune system is killing you. So that's a great point. I'll probably go into that a little bit later. Let me make a mention that when you're making all of this RNA and you're shooting out millions of viruses and you feel horribly sick, when you stick a swab in the nose, which if you don't already know, it probably has to go back to around where your ear is. It goes pretty far deep. It's safe, but it's not very comfortable. You're going to collect a sample that's clearly going to find pieces of this RNA. So this is one thing I want to stress. The PCR test, which is up here, the PCR test is only looking for a tiny piece of genetic material. It's just looking for, it's programmed to look for a tiny piece of genetic material where the testing machine magnifies it or multiplies it thousands and thousands of times so the machine can recognize it. It's actually pretty perfect in the sense that this polymerase chain reaction creates enough material that you can get a positive result. You mix it with a person who's feeling sick, you've got a diagnosis. You know this person has COVID. But here's the problem. When you recover and get better, you are still emanating little pieces of virus fragments, not the whole virus, but the test is going to pick up on these little tiny pieces because the test is not a test for the entire infectious virus. It's only a test for a little piece of the virus. So if you catch COVID, get sick, get tested positive, and then after about 6, 7, 8 days, you're getting better. You may have had a very mild disease. And the amount of virus coming out of you that could infect someone else goes down and down and then is no longer. But you're still coughing up little tiny pieces. So my point is, you're no longer infectious, but your test is still going to be positive. So this testing can be a very bad idea to get to prove you're better because it could be positive for up to 3 months. So this is frustrating. If you get a PCR test, it could be remaining positive for up to 3 months, but it does not mean you're infectious. We feel that after 10 days, you're pretty much recovered. Okay. Now, there are other tests that are coming out there. Let me go back to PCR. Some of the PCR tests can take days if you mail it off to a laboratory like Quest. If you do it in a machine, it could take 6 hours, it could take 1 hour, it could take 15 minutes. It depends on the machine. Some machines are better than others. But I tell you, if you got a positive test, I pretty much more or less believe it. If I got a negative test, I'm pretty careful in giving you the all clear, especially if you have symptoms or x-rays with shadows on your lungs. So it is a good test, But again, if it's positive after you've already been infected, I'm not sure I can believe it. And so if you force people to get tested, like walking down the street, and they come up positive, but they feel great, you may not be discovering a COVID infection. You may be discovering that this person actually had COVID 2 months ago, really didn't know it. They had a mild whatever, and they got over it really quickly. They didn't get tested. They never knew it. But now if you test them 2 months later, they're positive. You got a little bit of a mess. You might have done a good thing in discovering somebody who was going to get sick in the next couple of days because they're feeling fine now, or you simply discovered that they were sick in the past. So be very careful with PCR testing. It can get confusing. The next time, yes.
Dr. Haight, we have a question. Kathy, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yeah, and look at and use the chat box if you want to get to Kathy, to Debbie or me.
Okay. I hate to, that was such a good point. I'm glad you explained that about the test and then being positive for a time afterwards. But I want to go back because I want to be sure I understood what you said about when you have pre-existing conditions, how that sets you in a state of inflammation already. And then when you've got this new batch of inflammation, your body goes crazy. And you said your body doesn't know how to turn it off or tamp it down. Is that what you were saying?
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, your immune system is so well regulated that a young, healthy, no other diseases, gets infection. Our immune system recognizes it foreign. We attack it. We rev up our immune system. And then we have a feedback loop that actually slows down the immune system when we've gotten to that point where we've handled the infection, and it reduces the inflammation, and then we recover and the inflammation's gone because the infection's gone. That's a well-regulated immune system. A dysregulated or a poorly regulated immune system doesn't know how to shut it off or feed back on itself to say, okay, you've done enough. But instead, the immune system continues to pour into the lungs, causing inflammation. Basically, white blood cells, which turn into pus, block the airways, and you can't get oxygen in. So that gets to our treatments. We give treatments to turn off the immune system. If somebody is in that situation where they caught COVID, they got pretty sick, but now it's been about 7-8 days, and now all of a sudden they're getting sicker. They can't breathe. At that point, we give medicines to turn off the immune system and to reduce the inflammation to help them recover.
Okay. Thank you.
But I'll discuss it a little later.
Okay, Dr. Haight, one more question. Since the test can be positive for up to 3 months, how does this impact what we know about reinfection?
Yes, so our immune systems usually can prevent us from getting infected as long as the immune system remembers that particular germ. And for different germs, we can remember it our lifetime, or our immune system wanes or declines over time. We don't know with COVID. We've been throwing out the number 3 months, that we see antibodies for the first few months after infection. We don't see a lot of reinfection. It's pretty rare. So we don't expect a reinfection within a few months. But if somebody comes down with symptoms and they've been exposed, we'll still test them if it's been 2 or 3 months, but we tend not to test people within 3 months if they're otherwise without symptoms. After that, we're a little worried that people can get infected again if they get exposed again. We just don't know. So that's a big problem there. Let me mention the other testing that's out there. There's what's called antigen testing, and an antigen is basically a foreign piece of protein. It could be the part of the virus that you see here, this spike protein, or any of these proteins. These tests are done very rapidly. They're done within a few minutes. However, they're not very good if you don't have symptoms. In other words, it could come back negative even though you're infectious. So we can't always rely on these, but it's certainly if you're feeling sick and your antigen test is positive, you have COVID. It tends not to be lingering for a long period of time, but again, because it's a fragment it could be positive when you're really not infectious. So we sort of go back to, has it been 10 days since you first got sick? If it has been, you're probably free and clear if it's been a mild to moderate illness. The culture is if you grow the virus in tissue in a laboratory. This is not available. It would be wonderful if it was, because we could answer all those questions we just been talking about. Imagine a person catches COVID, they're positive as test, they get better. And just as we discussed, if we tested them again in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks, they might be still positive. People have come back to the hospital 3 weeks later with shortness of breath, fever, and chest pain. Debbie, I'll put you on the spot. What could that be caused by?
That could be flu, or that could be a respiratory infection.
Could be another germ. And we're sort of confused because if we COVID had tested them, they'd be positive. And that's what happened early on. They tested these people and said, oh my God, they're infected again, because they did get better. Then they got worse again. But in reality, it was not even infectious. COVID infects the lining of the blood vessels, raises the chance that inflammation occurs there, and then plus other risk factors the person might have, they develop a blood clot because of having had COVID. The blood clot forms in the leg, travels up to the lungs. Now they have a pulmonary embolism. They have a blood clot in the lung. Now they can't breathe, they're short of breath, they have a fever because of the blood clot, and there is no infection, but they've suffered a complication. So we have seen strokes, heart attacks, loss of limbs needing amputation because the blood vessels have clotted. And so, you would do a culture on this person, the culture would have been negative, but you would have done the other tests, because we got to be thinking more than just infection. This could be other things that are complicating it. And one of the reasons I showed that diagram of the hospital with the map, it shows that our hospital is always ready to take care of non-COVID patients, whether it is a heart attack, a car crash, a stroke, because we segregate the hospital so that there are areas that are COVID-free. So we've seen way too many people delay coming to the hospital because they were worried about COVID, but you need medical attention. You need to seek it right away. Now, I will mention there is what's called the antibody test, which means when you get infected with something, your body's immune system responds in many ways. One way that it responds is to make its own protein that can stick to the virus or stick to cells that are infected with the virus. And when this protein called an antibody is made by your body and your immune system, when it sticks to the virus or to an infected lining of your lungs, it attracts the rest of your immune system to go to attack it. So antibody production is very important, but for some diseases, the antibodies are made, but they don't do anything to really help in what we would hope. And those are called immunodominant antibodies, where they're made, but they don't necessarily cure the disease or prevent the disease. So this is where you can see that antibodies for treatment and for vaccination may or may not be helpful. But if the germ produces a neutralizing antibody, which is done in some diseases, those antibodies that your body makes attack the virus, stick to it, and help destroy it. And that's what you want a vaccine to make. That's what you want your body to make. And that's why we see people transfusing antibodies from a donated person who recovered from COVID, called convalescent plasma, is actually given as a treatment. Debbie, so as far as time, I am repeating some things that come later, so I know I can talk too long. So let me know when you're running out of time.
Okay. Well, this is extremely great information, and the chats that I am seeing, people are really appreciating this information. So I do not want to cut you off. So you take all the time you need, okay? I do have another question here. Have you seen people who have actually gotten the virus twice?
I haven't seen it, but it has been clearly reported that it does happen. But when you look at the entire world, I've seen 5 or 6, that have been reported. And that's where they've actually grown the virus, or they've discovered it was a different genetic form of the virus, where there's been minor mutations. And they've said, yeah, this is not the same virus they got infected with 2 months ago or 4 months ago. So yeah, it has happened, but it's really rare. We have not seen proof of this happening commonly. Many of you have seen my talk before. I usually just say that please don't touch your eyes, because your tear gland makes tears. And if you put the virus in your eye by touching it, you're not infecting the eye, but your tears will wash the virus down this little hole to the back of your nose. And that's one way you can get it. I think we've been...
Dr. Haight?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, can you go back to that? I was hoping, because you were saying before, and I've heard from others, I haven't been tested, but I've heard it is horrible. What if it's so contagious, why do they have to go so far? And on that, picture of our sinuses, you said it almost goes to the ear?
Yeah, it depends on the test. The most common test, it's a very small cotton swab. It's not really cotton, but it does go all the way back to about the back of your throat. And there is a passageway. They have to be careful if they know what they're doing. You don't ever go up, because you would think with the nose, you go level back towards the back of the ear, and then twirl it around. The reason, there's a few things, the infection is more likely to be there. There's less interfering digestive enzymes that you see in your mouth. The concentration at the end of the nose is not there, but there is tests that just do the tip of the nose. But if you do the tip of the nose, the mistake they were making is they were putting it in a little bit of fluid to transport it to the laboratory. And that little bit of fluid would dilute the sample you got from the tip of your nose just on the inside of your nose. And so what the company said, no, you're doing it wrong. This was a national story. They said, well, you got to go straight from the nose into the machine cartridge. So each test is a little different. We often in the intensive care unit want to get it deep from the lungs. And we can't use those samples on some of the machines. They're just not designed to tolerate the kinds of processing that has to occur to get an accurate test. The virus is often stuck to these mucus or snot granules here. These things that can come out of you are often stuck onto this, and the virus and the mucus will fall down with gravity. And that's why they really feel that it's really the 3 to 5 feet. And most of the infections we see are explained because people have been riding in the same car, they've been talking in the same office, they were not wearing their mask. But the key thing here is, if this person would only wear a mask, it would really prevent this from spreading. There are germs that do float on the air more than COVID, like measles, chickenpox, tuberculosis. The flu and COVID tend not to float on the air unless you're really sick and pushing them out. But you can imagine a very confined room with very bad air, many people in the room, and a few of them having COVID. You're raising your exposure. So this is not well understood. But we do know it can't live that long. And the key is to wear a mask. There was an article I read, part of it last night, that said that, this person over here wearing a mask, it's again, mainly to keep them from spreading it, because they could be sick and then not know it. They may have spreading it, but they're having no symptoms. So them wearing a mask is important. But can a mask protect them? The bottom line of the study was, getting just a tiny amount, which is not enough to cause you to be sick, may be enough to cause you to have an immune response. And we're still trying to understand that. So wearing a mask is showing some other benefits. They asked me, should we be mandating a mask? And I'm not getting into freedoms and protecting the public and all that. Just our advice was, look, to me, it's been very clear, and I think the science backs it up. The masks have reduced the spread of the virus. When you look at cities and people that have not worn masks, the spread of the virus has been greater. And granted, there are a lot of biases in this and a lot of other things that could have made the diseases better, but the masks seem to be timed with a reduction in cases. Clearly, we know that if you're asymptomatic, it helps reduce the spread of the germs coming out, but we have to make sure people don't touch their masks on the inside and then not wash their hands. So being careful, reminding your team that you work with that you want to treat your mask as an infectious object, both from the inside and the outside of it, so just touch the edges of it. And why should we continue the mask mandate? Well, I mean, I think that the unpredictable circumstances of school just starting, did people behave themselves during Labor Day? What about family gatherings? Are people dropping their guard? I mean, there's still a lot of things we don't know. And whenever you don't know a lot of things, it's probably not a good idea to go backwards in your efforts to prevent the spread of a disease. I think another issue is we have to do more to protect the schools. I think the bottom line with the schools is that you can do a lot to keep people from catching it and spreading it inside the school. But when you got outside the school, things not doing well, like holiday gatherings or people not wearing masks, think of schools coming back into session. Where does that leave the parents? Well, the parents are now going out of the house and now getting back to work or going out into the community. That raises the number of contact points where the germ can be spread, and then it's barraging the schools. So it's a very difficult situation for the schools to manage this, to be able to not only keep people from spreading it, but to have new cases popping up. Next is we're certainly going to have the holidays coming up in a few weeks, and people are going to be traveling and going home, and this has become a challenge too. So for all those reasons, it's like, my advice was, this is not the time to relax mask wearing. Do we want to base it on the number of cases or the number of deaths? I would say no. I think we need to base it on, is there a vaccine and is there an effective treatment? We can also look at what the CDC recommends. But I would think, we've got to take steps to keep this from flaring up, because it is flaring up again in the large numbers in other countries that had gotten a lot better, but now it's getting worse again. Please be careful in using the words quarantine and isolation. Bottom line of this slide is, quarantine is when you're not sick. You've just been exposed. You don't know if you're going to catch it. You don't know if you're infectious, and you could become infectious at any moment. You could be sick at any moment, but you're not. And in those situations, we call it a quarantine. Now, if you're sick, that's isolation. So I tend to use those terms separately, even though you do hear overlap, because the word can be used in multiple ways. But I tend to say we put a person in isolation if they're sick. We put a person in quarantine only if they've been exposed. And I think we've sort of gone over this quite a bit. Just to show you a few gross photographs, but the disease, when I talked about the immune system not being well regulated, it overreacts. Well, the one place you can see this is in the skin. And as you know, my wife's a dermatologist, so she is keeping an eye out for these things. But when you get COVID, we notice that during the recovery phase, sometimes we see reactions in the skin that are similar to other diseases we've seen in the past, which were where the immune system was inadvertently getting hung up in the skin. And the great thing about the skin is you can easily see it. So these kinds of patterns can be predictive of someone who might have a serious case where there's a lot of immune system being deposited in the skin and inflammation showing up in the skin. So this is this overly inflammation state where you'll get these little target lesions on the skin, and that could show that you have an overreaction. I don't think I'll go into the symptoms. I think you all know the symptoms pretty well, and the taste and smell. I think you all know what to look out for. Certainly when people tell you that they're confused or their lips are turning blue, you don't have to really say to somebody you have to go to the emergency room. But we do want to make sure you are stressing stroke symptoms. Fumbling, that faster kind of acronym, that the face or the, you're fumbling to find words, your arms are weak, you're dropping objects, you're having trouble walking. Please look out for stroke symptoms because that could be reversible. And again, heart attacks and other breathing problems or leg swelling could be another thing. You've seen this list before. I do want to point out that the people who are doing the worst, and in fact, almost every young person who was on a ventilator, when I looked at about 14 people on the ventilator that were under the age of 55, every one of them was very obese, 300 pounds around. And I think it really opens a window into us understanding what goes on when you have high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes, that there is this low level of inflammation that's occurring that is certainly doesn't need gasoline poured on it, which is the COVID virus and all the inflammation that comes with that. So one good piece of news is there's been a couple articles saying that asthma is not a huge risk factor for a bad outcome. They've shown that asthma folks tended to do just like everyone else. And sort of fitting with what I just said, people with HIV and AIDS do fairly well. Makes sort of sense. Their immune system does not overreact because they have an impairment of their immune system. So we've certainly seen all these things too. Let me talk about treatments here at the hospital. There is no cure. But we do use medications that try to interfere with the virus as soon as it attacks. And so remdesivir interferes with the replication of the virus. Think of it like Tamiflu. If you don't get it in time, it's probably not worth getting. So it is something we're giving for people who are short of breath that it can be given sort of upfront early on. And we also give convalescent plasma, and we try to give that early on. Now, remdesivir has shown itself to be beneficial when studied in the appropriate way. So here's my little nod to sort of social media, is when you do a trial where there's no bias, in other words, you've eliminated that by randomizing the patients and you follow them going into the future as opposed to looking back to the past, and you've done what's called a double-blinded study where you've given the patient either a placebo or you've given them a medicine like remdesivir, and it's double-blinded, meaning the patient doesn't know what they're getting and the doctors and the nurses don't know what they're giving. That's a double-blinded study, placebo-controlled, randomized. That's been shown to benefit. I don't believe we have that information for convalescent plasma. But what we do know for convalescent plasma is that it's safe, and there does seem to be some science behind getting more antibodies to people. But keep in mind that the donation of the plasma is not being checked for what level of antibodies are being transfused. They just know that they're there. They don't know if it's the right antibodies or the highest level or versus the moderate level. And so we're giving it because we feel that it is safe and that antibodies probably play a role, but we're not sure how beneficial this is. Now, getting to the other things is once the immune system is overreacting and making the person sick, we give a very inexpensive steroid called dexamethasone. A steroid pretty much slows down the immune system. That can be a bad thing, but here it's actually a beneficial thing. And this has been proven in some of these double-blind placebo-controlled trials. Tocilizumab is actually an antibody that blocks part of your immune system. So here you're actually using an antibody to slow the immune system down, which is sort of reminiscent to what I was referring to earlier about this feedback loop that normal people have to slow down the immune system. Here, tocilizumab is given to slow down one part of your immune system that is overreacting in a COVID infection. Now, it's not only medicines. We actually take patients that are not able to get the oxygen in, and we lay them down face down onto their hospital bed. Now, this is a bit awkward. It's a bit difficult, but we found that when you lay down on your stomach, you actually open your lungs up better, and you don't need as much pressure to force the oxygen in there, and the person actually does better. Now, we can do this on a person who's on a breathing machine, but if you're awake and sort of cooperative, we can do it when you're not on a breathing machine. Now, obviously, there's oxygen. So I just want to show you that, yes, you can give oxygen through a nasal cannula, which is shown in this picture here. And you can turn the dial up. If the person is mildly short of breath, you can put in oxygen at about 2 liters per minute. And if you're more short of breath, you can just turn the dial up, and it can go up to 4 and 8 and 10, 10. But once you get up to around 10 liters per minute, that's so much oxygen coming out of this little, and by the way, this little tube is very short. You're almost seeing everything here. That little tube is just barely inside the nose. Is if you turn it up too high, the oxygen is just coming out of the person. So if they're still short of breath, this is not working because you can only turn it up so high. So next you would go to a mask, which sort of tries to keep more oxygen there, but even that can fail because oxygen is still going to leak out. You can put on a very tight mask, and not only is it tight, there's a computer attached to this machine that actually blows oxygen in simultaneously timed to your attempt to breathe in. So it senses when you breathe in, and it takes advantage of that to puff in a little oxygen to get a little more pressure. And that, that can work too, to get oxygen in there. This, however, is a little bit on the dangerous side for the people caring for you, because if you're infectious with COVID, when you're adding pressure to somebody with a germ, you're probably squirting it out in various places, and this can make the room a little more contagious. So we try to do this in special rooms, and we absolutely make sure that our team is wearing a mask, eye shield protection, gowns, because this certainly raises the risk of spreading. But if your lungs are so full of pus that you cannot get the oxygen in, we have to move to what's called intubation. And intubation is where we're putting a tube, and it's this tube here. This tube we're putting down into the throat, into your trachea or your breathing tube, which leads to your lungs. Again, we don't want to go down too far where we're only going onto the right side or to the left side. It's got to stop right here. But right about here are your vocal cords. And the doctor or nurse or the nurse anesthetist uses this battery-operated light, which has a very dull projection here that helps move the tongue out of the way. So you can imagine holding this with one hand and going in this direction, going this direction. This then moves the tongue out of the way, and then the doctor can look with their own eyes and see the vocal cords and make sure the tube is being placed in the right position, as opposed to the swallowing tube. You don't want to put it in the swallowing tube because then that would be pumping air into the stomach. Now they have cameras nowadays. They put a camera on this, and the video camera actually has a little television screen right up here, and you can see it that way, which is very helpful. Then they pump in a tiny amount of air, and this tiny amount of air inflates a balloon. And so this balloon inflates around the tube, so oxygen can go in the center, and then it can't leak out because of this tube. That's called ventilation. And then what they do is they hook this tube up to a ventilator, and that helps you breathe by forcing highly concentrated oxygen at pressure into the lungs to inflate them. And they do that quite a bit. If that doesn't work, the only last resort is to use ECMO, which is like a heart-lung machine. And this takes the place of your lungs. It takes blood out of your blood vessels, takes it out into a machine that puts oxygen in it and removes the carbon dioxide, and then a pump pumps it back into your body. This is something you don't do at the very beginning because it's very invasive, it has complications, but it's a last resort. And sometimes we've had, just many patients, still not do well with it. And other patients where the families have decided they just didn't want to put their loved one through it because they were already very sick and had other problems. But this has to usually be done at another hospital in Tampa or Orlando. I did want to mention that children can have an overreaction of their immune system that is rare, but we have to look out for it. It is treatable, but it can be a few weeks after they have COVID. They all of a sudden develop fever, body aches, nausea. They get skin rashes. They may have heart problems, trouble breathing. And that's an emergency where they want to treat this right away and be able to give the treatment for it, which is actually giving antibodies that actually, these antibodies called immune globulin, actually help tone the immune system down and tone it down so they can recover. So we want to look out for that. We have not seen that here, but there's been a few cases in Florida. So we have to watch out for that. Okay, I didn't mention hydroxychloroquine. I didn't mention ivermectin. There are studies where you take ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine in a laboratory and pour them on top of monkey cells from a kidney and try to infect them with COVID or SARS. Actually, they keep showing this one article about the original SARS from the early 2000s, and the cells didn't get that infected. And there's reasons why. Hydroxychloroquine changes the chemistry inside of cells. It has maybe an impact on the virus. It may even have an impact on the immune system. Some really interesting news or good information. But it's actually got to be shown to work in people. And we've used it, and we had patients do great on it. We had patients die on it. We can't really find a statistical basis to say that this is a good medication. We have a team of doctors, pharmacists, scientists here at the hospital. We review all the medical literature that we can find. We even view social media. We take questions. We try to work with the families to explain that, this medicine, really we don't have this kind of background of is it working or can it work? As some will say, well, you give it a shot. Well, we're certainly open to that, but we don't see the kind of benefit. And there is small amount of risks. I don't think there's large risks in taking hydroxychloroquine, but there are some small risks. So anyway, I think that's been a sort of a challenging thing that people have made a bit complicated here over time. Let me mention the vaccines. This is on pretty much the end here. We had an issue with the vaccines. Let me make sure we all understand. I think when you get a real infection with any germ, our body recognizes it as foreign, and our immune system attacks it. And our immune system attacks in many ways. One way is to make antibodies to the foreign, whatever it is. Could be a splinter, could be a virus, could be a bacteria. Those antibodies may or may not have a role in fighting the infection. There are certain bacteria that are designed that the antibodies just bounce right off of it. The antibodies are made, but they really don't do anything. But with these kinds of germs, the antibodies are a key thing. So what they do for most vaccines is they'll take the germ, they'll go into a laboratory, they'll infect some kind of living tissue, like an egg embryo or cells, monkey cells or insect cells, and they will infect those cells. And what they'll do is they'll make millions and millions of actual viruses. Then they will deactivate the virus in the laboratory. They'll chop it up chemically, purify it, get certain pieces that they know really wake up your immune system, and they put it in a shot, and that's how they give a vaccine. Your body sees these little pieces of the virus, like the flu shot. You cannot catch the flu from it because it's only a piece of the virus. And your immune system recognizes it, make antibodies, and then when you get exposed to the real virus, which has that piece sticking out of it, your immune system can attack it and hopefully slow it down. Okay, so that's how we generally do most vaccines. I'll show you an exception to that, but that's most vaccines, right? So the other thing they can do for vaccines is they could create a weakened version of the disease-causing virus. Think of the measles, chickenpox, shingles. They have what's called a live virus vaccine. Measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, there's a few others. There used to be the oral polio virus. These viruses are given maybe through injection, or with oral polio, you took it in the mouth. They would cause a little minor infection that would not get you sick, but it would wake up your immune system, and your immune system would produce antibodies so that when the real full strength virus came along, you could fight it off. And that's how the measles vaccine works, and it works great. Now, you could also take the genetic material from COVID and stick it inside of a cold virus where you've removed the genetic material of the cold virus. So this virus is not going to cause a cold, but you've not put in all of the genes from COVID. You've only put in a few genes. So imagine what happens. You give this to a person as a vaccination. What used to be a cold virus goes in and infects you, but puts in the genetic material of the COVID virus, but not enough to make COVID viruses, but just enough to express the proteins that your immune system could recognize. This is what they're doing with COVID. It takes about 10 years to make a vaccine in the past. We don't have 10 years. So they have turned to technology that they had been working on for the last 20 years to rapidly make a vaccine. Now, the viral vector is not what you're hearing about on the news. This is just one option. Let me show you another one that's the rapidly manufactured. There's what's called gene-based. This is where you vaccinate the person with genetic material from the virus. It's not all of the genetic material, it's just part of the genetic material. So you inject the genetic material, this genetic material goes into your cells. And remember what I said back with that earlier slide here? This genetic material takes over part of your cell's machinery and tells your cells to make whatever the genetic material was programmed to make, in this case, protein. And you make the protein, let's just say they use the COVID virus genetic material to make the spike protein, those little things that were sticking out. You make the spike protein, your body will immediately recognize it as something that shouldn't be there, and your immune system produces antibodies to it, and those antibodies then are ready in case you get re-exposed to the real deal. And you could hopefully stop it before it sets up an infection in your throat and lungs. So this is what's called this is what's called a mRNA vaccine. These have not been used before for other diseases as far as FDA approved. They've been studied in other diseases, but these have never been put out to the community as a FDA approved vaccine. Okay, so I have about 100 questions, but I'll go from that. But that's where we're at right now. This is the vaccines that are coming very quickly. Okay, so common questions I have. Whoa, genetic material, that's a little new. Can this genetic material get incorporated into your genetic material? And the answer is no. I mean, this is RNA, not DNA. This does degrade and fall apart in a short period of time, but just long enough to make these proteins, but not long enough to be around for a long time. Let's see, what other questions did I have? can this process occur and run amok where you make too much of it or your body overreacts to it? So far, that's not been seen in all the other studies. As you heard, they had to cancel a trial because somebody had a neurologic side effect. It was probably like one out of, I don't know, it was like 1 out of 5,000 or 1 out of 30,000. But they have to watch out whenever you're stimulating the immune system. Sometimes the immune system can start to stick to things that are a part of your body. And that happens in nature. That could be like a disease like lupus. But they've seen that with infections. When you make antibodies to fight an infection, sometimes your immune system is an innocent bystander, and you get what's called Guillain-Barré syndrome or transverse myelitis, where your nerves get irritated and you develop weakness or paralysis. And that could be serious. Can a vaccine do this? Yes, but infections can do it even more so. So they're going to have to watch that carefully. And since I'm dealing with a small group here, I've tried to present this. This is probably the second time I've tried to cover vaccines. I'm curious did I scare the crap out of you, or did I make you, at least informed? You may ask me, am I going to get a vaccine? Well, if they can show me that it's safe and effective, I'll get a vaccine. And looking forward to that. One closing slide is on our website, which is mylrh.org. We do have a business resource center and other information for schools and other organizations to help you with this. And certainly what I do is I can be available for different questions as we try to work through problems together. I mean, often I might not have the answers, and I hope what I said in the last few minutes was accurate, but I'll just sort of go for them. But Debbie, so what's your impression of what I just said on this vaccine? Because, I don't think people know, when you get told they're making a vaccine, you're like, oh, man, they're making a vaccine. They're making a vaccine like they make flu vaccine, or the shingles, or this HPV vaccine, which can prevent cancer. All great things. I'm a big supporter of that. Now, well, they're making a vaccine for COVID. Is it important to know how they made it, or is it too much scientific information? Like, I don't need to know that. Just give me the shot that works.
Well, I tell you what, we got a question and then I'll comment. Kathy, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
I heard that the vaccines, Dr. Haight, that they were working on were similar to what they tried to do with SARS or MERS. Is that what this is that you're talking about?
Yeah, what's really, I mean, I don't want to use words like opportunistic, but this has been, I mean, I heard about this type of vaccine about 20 years ago, and I was just like, wow, that's a great idea, because in the old vaccines, when you chop up a deactivated virus and purify it and inject it into a person, that's okay. I mean, at least you're showing your immune system what the enemy looks like without showing them the whole enemy. And I said, that's okay. But this new vaccine, think about it, when you give the genetic material, this mRNA, and it goes into your cells, and your cells make little pieces of part of the virus, it's putting it out on the surface of your cells for your immune system to recognize, albeit temporary. Think of how much more effective that is for your immune system. Your immune system is not just seeing little pieces of vaccine injected and floating around from the old vaccine. It's actually, your immune system's actually seeing pieces of this virus on your cells. So not only are you recognizing the foreign piece of the virus to be able to attack it if you get infected, it's also seeing it on your cells. And I think that adds an additional layer to your immune system response, because your immune system not only goes after the virus floating around, it goes after the infected cells to shut them down. And I think these vaccines provide an advantage. So 20 years ago, I thought, wow, this is really great science, but it hasn't come forward with other vaccines. Now, opportunistically, along comes COVID, and all these scientists have got 5, 10, 20 years of work that they've been doing. Here's a national, international emergency that gives the green light to do what they've already learned. They've learned a lot on how to safely give this kind of vaccine in small numbers and how to make it more effective. Like maybe it needs 2 doses, or maybe it needs a certain kind of this. But here's the power of what is happening is you could theoretically give a vaccine with 50 different kinds of mRNA from 50 different germs. And with one shot, you've now vaccinated somebody against 50 different germs. Now, I threw that number out, which is one number that I read, but it doesn't have to be 50, maybe it's 5. But at any rate, not only could that happen, but when you recognize a brand new germ, it only takes a few days to recreate the mRNA. You don't have to take it to a lab and grow it in an egg embryo and do this, which takes a long, long time. So this mRNA vaccine is a very new technology. And I do sort of see where they're not necessarily touting that aspect of it. I can imagine why, but you know, to me, I like information. I want to know what's going on, and I'm okay with this as long as they have answered my questions and showed me that it is safe, but then also, is it effective? They've used this for hepatitis C, I believe, and HIV, and the antibodies that were being made by the mRNA didn't stop the infection or prevent it. But those are different germs. Those germs mutate a lot. There's a lot of difficulty in getting a vaccine to work for those germs. COVID maybe is a little bit more in the flu category where it's just challenging. You know, as you know, flu vaccine works some years and other years it doesn't work as well. But even in those years, getting a flu vaccine helps you end up with a more mild infection of the flu. So I don't know. I'm still debating on how to present this information. Is it worth presenting? You know, depending on the audience. I'm certain audiences. You know, I know people that I don't want to know that level of detail, or it's confusing, or I don't know if I explained it well.
Dr. Haight, we have had many people on this say how great this was. They private messaged me to say thank you. Some have had to go. And you had said you would stay on and answer questions. So I'm hoping people will ask those questions. And my thought just disappeared. But one thing that I've been wondering is, do you feel our flu season is going to be much worse with the COVID? How do you think our flu season is going to be?
So, I mean, in a huge mixed message is clearly you're going to hear, get your vaccine for flu. When? Now. Okay, now is the time. You know, I thought it was a little early in August, you know, and maybe last week, but from here until October, go ahead and get it. Granted, if you feel you don't really respond well to vaccines, like you're elderly and things like that, you know, maybe wait a little longer. But I tend to say by October, you know, we should all be vaccinated by October. It should protect you through the flu season, and you're going to hear that message very strongly. I think on the other hand, I think we're going to have a very mild flu season, and you can see where there's a problem there. If you really start predicting a mild flu season, there's going to be a few people that say, well, yeah, here's my opportunity not to get vaccinated. And we don't want that. I think we need to be careful. We need to get everyone vaccinated. But there's a lot of indications that this is not going to be a severe flu season. The Southern Hemisphere, for a variety of reasons, has not seen a large flu during their winter. And certainly all the steps we have in social distancing and mask wearing, and hopefully this vaccine campaign will pretty much eliminate this as a additional headache we don't want to deal with. You know, we had plenty of patients co-infected with COVID and rhinovirus, adenovirus, RSV, metapneumovirus. They had two viruses at the same time, and flu, by the way. So we really don't want to have to deal with that. You do get sicker when you have two viruses infecting you. 30 years ago, I would have told you you really couldn't get two viruses at the same time. I was wrong. They've proven that pretty clearly. And we've seen people catch two different types of flu at the same time. So yeah, get the flu shot. And if you're older, I think they have, there's a more potent flu vaccine that's been out for a few years, and that's had good data saying that I would get that. And I forgot the age cutoff, if it's 55 or 60.
Okay, I would like you to look into your crystal ball.
My coffee lady.
Okay. Look into your crystal ball. How long do you see this lasting?
So in some form or another, this is good. I mean, I'm prepared for the next 2 years, you know, but what I mean to say is I would imagine around March, we would have a vaccine that is a real issue, you know, that by March or April, we should be underway in some sort of vaccine plan. Keep in mind, there'll be multiple vaccines out there. Do I want to get the first one, which is got these characteristics, or do I want to wait for the third one that has these characteristics, or the one that's $300, or the one that's $20, or the one that's the most convenient? So you can imagine the headaches involved in that. But I think the distribution of millions of doses of vaccines are going to be a big challenge. But I think we will probably end up with more flares as soon as people relax their guard, and that's going to be natural, is people are going to be sort of done with the mask wearing and the getting back together, and then you're going to have a few weeks after that a big surge of cases, and we're going to be going sort of like a yo-yo for the next 6 months. So it's
Okay, another, you said something earlier about the holidays coming up. And we know that the holidays usually bring about a lot of travel, you know, airplane travel, busiest days during Thanksgiving and Christmas. So what are your thoughts on stepping onto an airplane?
Well, somebody mentioned, you know, personal experience. It may have been related to the particular airline. You know, there are certainly some airlines where your experience might be a bit nerve-wracking. I would certainly wear a pretty thorough eye protection in addition to my rather protective mask. I wouldn't wear just any old mask. I'd probably wear a fairly good mask, you know, like a N95. I'd wear my eye protection. I'd have my bottle of sanitizer with me, wipe down surfaces. The going to the bathroom would be, to me, one of the more riskier things because of all the touched surfaces. And I think it can be done. I mean, you know, this is not a magical germ. I mean, it's got to go from a sick person, and at least people, you know, hopefully, depending on when you're going, if you're leaving a city which has done rather well with their numbers, you know, that might be a good sign. Certainly leaving a city that's having an outbreak, certainly people whose temperature may be normal may be expelling the virus. So I'd worry more about those situations. But having my eye protection and mask on, I think that's good. I think the danger is really in trusting that the family member or the friend that you're visiting doesn't have COVID. That's where the infection is going to occur. You're going to be in the car with them, and you're going to feel it awkward to be wearing a mask in a car with the people that are picking you up at the airport, or you're going to feel awkward asking them to wear a mask. depending upon which political party they're in. I don't know, but you know, the bottom line is you got to move past that. You know, I had somebody was going to be in a very close situation with other people that they didn't know that well, and I said, look, you gotta clear this up before you go. Are you going to wear a mask or not? And it's not a political question. It's like, I don't know if you're going to be getting sick. Now, if you tell me you've been isolating yourself at home and you've been careful, I could see dropping my guard. But everyday folks that have been out there trying to get back to life, you don't know if they picked up the virus. And so if you're going to be in a car with them, it's like, do you mind, you know, before you even set this thing up, you're going to be wearing a mask. No, that's what I would do.
Okay, are there other questions? This has been wonderful, Dr. Haight. And I know we've lost a couple of people, but, and Dr. Haight, if you'll quit sharing your screen, and we'll see if there's any hand raised. Okay, so does anybody else have any questions?
Or good stories.
Yeah, exactly. Sarah? No? Okay. Well, hearing none, Dr. Haight, this has been totally awesome. We truly appreciate your time. From what everybody has said, they have loved this session with you and really appreciate everything that you've done. So a big hand to you.
Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
please reach out if you have particular questions or unique situations. It's not out of the ordinary. I certainly get calls from the private schools, and I mean, in fact, I had one of it was an instant message from one of my Facebook friends that I probably didn't even know very well. Actually, I didn't know. And they just said, please help me. I know somebody who has someone in the hospital, hasn't been able to visit them, worried about them, and I haven't heard how they've been, you know, doing. And it happened because, you know, the person was being transferred from one floor to another. And when that happens in the morning, it takes time for the new nurse and new doctor to get to know the patient, to feel that they can answer questions. So just that little bit of time, that maybe extra 2 hours where they normally would hear a report first thing in the morning, I mean, it creates a bit of concern. So, you know, gladly be able to reach out to the physician and say, you know, I know this is a new patient for you, but can you reach out to the family member and just, you know, update them on the plan? Unfortunately, everything was working out well, but, you know, we got to put yourselves in other people's shoes. Not having as many visitors in the hospital has clearly protected our team, but we have to also be on top of what this means for families and the passage of communication.
I did, so, Dr. Haight, thank you for that. And we hope we don't have to take you up on that in the future. But I did want to ask about visitors. Has Lakeland Regional Health opened up to visitors? Because having a sick family member and not being able to be with them can be really
so we definitely have, we've always tried to have exceptions for certain circumstances. And it has gone to the point where even if the visitor has likely active COVID, we have found a way to safely bring them into the hospital if it was absolutely necessary. So we have made exceptions on individual basis. So we start with a basic standard operating procedure. And I think all of you do this in your own business lives, is that we try to avoid the word policy because we don't want to break the policy, but we use the word standard operating procedure. And when a unique situation comes up, we can do something different because it's clearly not a standard situation. So you bring up a really good point. And so we have made individual assessments on the risks, but we also are changing our visitors policy too. Certainly we've done this for people coming in for surgeries because we know that the spouse may be needing their own caretaker to come in. And so there's two people coming in. We also are, I believe we are changing to increase visitation. But this can present a bit of a stress because of with the increased visitation, our nursing teams have to get adapted to a new way of life, which they've gotten used to over 4 months. So again, we want to move in that direction. Yes.
Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah.
All right. Debbie, you're on mute.
Okay, any other questions? Well, we are going to hold off on viewing the video with Dr. Greger, because certainly this really was very, very beneficial, Dr. Haight, and we truly thank you for your time, answering all of the questions, but really for a tremendous presentation.
Oh, and Sarah, you have a question, but please email me your thoughts on those vaccine slides, because that's we've got to think forward here. What's the next biggest hurdle? And it's this vaccine. And I want to make sure that I'm working through how to present this. And what did you find that was alarming or beneficial to that, Sarah?
Yeah, I guess it just kind of came to me. But what are your thoughts about kids going back to school, to the brick and mortar? I know that they've done both e-learning and it's a choice, but I know, like, for my children, they wanted to go back to school. And so we're doing everything we can. You know, I've got masks, they get a clean one every day. They have hand sanitizers they put, but I just wanted to know your overall thoughts, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's really age dependent too, as the level of issues that have to be dealt with from older students and younger students. And not saying that one's bad or worse. I mean, some of the older students, as far as compliance, might be more of a issue, and the younger kids, might be more obedient with following rules. I told a couple folks, I mean, as an infectious disease person, it's almost, maybe a gut instinct to say we should all lock ourselves in a bathroom for 3 months, and that's my answer, and then I follow that up with, but I'm not an economist, and I'm not a child psychologist, and I'm not an educator. And I realize that answer is not the answer. And then and if you've followed what I've said before, I can cop out by saying, well, it's the school board's decision. I'm not here to make that decision for them. They have to make that decision. But what I did say was, if you decide to go back to school in brick and mortars, I will provide as much advice as possible, along with the health department, to make it as safe as possible. So, granted, it concerns me when there's such a variety of rule following, where you hear stories of a teacher saying, okay, we're going to take a mask break. Everybody in the front row can take their masks off, and everybody in the third row and everybody in the fifth row. Well, that's not a good idea. And no, it's okay to wear the mask below the nose. And it's almost like, squeezing a balloon, and you'll have it pop out somewhere else. So you try to go then talk to that school, and then you find out that another school was rejecting our test result because they thought it was the wrong type of test, called an antigen test. And we're like, no, it's not an antigen test. This child does not need a second test. They can come back to school because they really were negative. So I find that the schools are going to be a big challenge. There's going to be misunderstandings, and it's going to be, and as I told a couple of school board members, you add in the level of privacy into this issue. So when somebody gets an illness, out of respect for privacy, you're not going to get the details that the health department and the school is going to get, but they're trying to make sure they're protecting. And I think they're probably being abundantly cautious by any possible case. They're probably closing that class down, putting them in quarantine, where scientifically, if I had all the information, and I did have a long talk with the health department director yesterday, and I liked what they were doing. They were individually diving into the situation and realizing that, oh, this teacher is not the kind of teacher that walks up and down the hallways. Up and down the rows of chairs. This is a teacher that you can confirm was always in one part of the classroom, always wearing a mask, always had eye shields on, and the child that ended up sick didn't catch it in the classroom, but caught it in a family gathering elsewhere, but sat always right here, and they were in a closed-knit group, and here's how we're going to proceed. And I was like, yeah, you made that sensible for that situation. But you try to explain that to not just 20 parents, but 24 parents or whatever. And everyone has their own, like, heard bits and pieces of it. And then you add imagination, then you add worry, and then conspiracy theories. And after a while,
Right, exactly.
so it becomes a huge challenge. But I think by being overly cautious, I think they'll get, in a few weeks, it'll be under everyone's belt, that they'll feel secure in moving forward. And again, another reason why not to stop any mask mandates. But I think in about 3 or 4 weeks, we will be understanding the rules of this crazy time. And when somebody says, well, teacher's now out sick with COVID. Okay, well, did you do A, B, C, and D? Yep. All right. Well, and everyone's going to be used to this new reality. But, you know, what's going to happen, as you already seen, you know, a teacher somewhere in the United States has died. I don't recall whether they caught it at school. But again, we do know people are catching things outside of school. But that's the only goal I have for school. Keep it a safe environment, do everything possible, and respond to the information that occurs. And don't try to make it like a cookbook where it's a regimented recipe, because there's too much variables. So if somebody said something like, well, our magic number is 3. If we get 3 cases, we're going to do this. And I said, don't do that, because you may get to 3 and you are feeling that everything's under control, but you're now forced to take an action, because a month ago you said if we got to 3 or 5 or 9 or whatever the number was, you're going to take action. And now you're at that number and everybody sort of feels you don't need to take that action. But there will be people that will say, hey, 2 months ago you said you would do this, and why aren't you doing it? You lied to us. The opposite can occur. Things could be on fire and you set the magic number to be 9 and you only have 1, but things are just blowing up around you, and it is clearly the wrong decision to be waiting to get to 9. And so don't set that number. Be very careful about that. Make sure you're getting a sense of the entire situation that can't be put in writing. And that's where you need people like Dr. Jackson and others going through the details, and you know, doing common sense. The part that's hard is communicating. You can make great decisions, but if you don't communicate it clearly, it doesn't matter what your decision was. So I think the schools in session can be done. I think there are going to be successes and there are going to be failures, and I think we have to respond to the slip-ups and correct them, and hopefully get this to move forward.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Great feedback.
Thanks.
Well, Dr. Haight, once again, thank you. And also, I have been recording this. Do you mind me sharing this with our Polk wellness professionals?
Oh, that's good. I try to always think back to say, well, what jokes did I say that would not look good in writing? So I've been very careful. I've been trying.
Yeah, I don't think there was any political puns or anything like that. So you're good.
All right. No, please. I think going back and looking at the slides or seeing questions, I think that's really helpful because that's a lot of information, a lot of information. And to me, it takes me 3 or 4 or 5 times just to hear it. And I think I want to be able to the point where I could explain it. And there's some things that's why I asked about the vaccine issue, that is new for me to present. So I want to make sure I'm explaining it so that it is even helpful. And I have to even go back to say, what does it matter? A vaccine is a vaccine. It's approved. Who cares how it works? Well, I find it interesting, but my interest could be something that doesn't go over well, so I'd have to see how that, and I'm curious on how the mainstream media will cover it also.
Well, I know I'm afraid to have the vaccine, so.
Yeah, I probably would not volunteer to be in a trial, but I probably would be fairly upfront in getting it if they showed me that the immunity was long lasting, because I would, if I got the vaccine, which would probably be a 2-dose series, But if I knew that my antibodies would just, I was going to be susceptible 3 months later or 6 months later, you know what? I'd rather be on my guard. I rather would not have a false sense of security. But I'm if they show me that the immunity is going to be at least lasting for a year, I would go get it, because I really am in a position where when I'm seeing patients at Tampa General, I don't want to be this kind of nervousness, and then seeing patients here at Lakeland Regional, I want to make sure I'm protected. So I'm probably going to go and get it when they show me that it generates immunity, and I know the neurologic complications are going to happen in people who are unvaccinated. So it's not surprising that they did the right thing in holding one trial based upon a neurologic complication. But I know the infection can cause neurologic complications. So to me, it's a tiny risk compared to a big risk I'm preventing with a vaccine. So yeah, I'm going to get the vaccine. I just have to see the data.
Well, hopefully you can report back to us
Yeah.
as time goes forward, and let us know when we are safe to get the vaccine.
I'll probably videotape me getting the vaccine. I did that with the flu vaccine. You always get a video of me getting it, and they'll post that video. I always felt bad for the nurse giving me the shot. Which reminds me, I'm probably going to go to get my flu shot today. Personally, I usually get the one called Flu Block, which is not in a egg. So there's certain vaccines that are not made with eggs. Not that I have anything against eggs, but I find that this is a newer way to make a vaccine, where there's not as many ingredients in it, but it has the same components of the virus to fight the infection. So it's the egg-free version. So I just tend to get that one.
And where do you get that?
You have to call around. That is hard to find. I think there's 2 of them on the market. I forget the name. One is called Flu Block with FLUBLOK. But the other one is out there too, and it's pretty much, it's an egg-free version, so it has fewer preservatives in it, fewer egg proteins in it. But I've never been allergic to eggs, but these were initially made for that reason. And I think the immunity that's generated could be slightly better, but still need to do more studies. And once I turn 55 or 60, I'll get the high dose one. So.
Everybody have a tremendous weekend. Thank you again, Dr. Haight.
Thank you, Dr. Haight.
We will see y'all next month. Okay?
Thanks for joining.